Welcome. My name is Ken Dvorak. I am the Director of Distance Learning at the college. And a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Bashira came into my office and we got talking about the conference, and he arm twisted me enough to organize a panel that he wanted to do virtually. The college owns a Zoom license, so it was my pleasure reaching out to our panelists. They stretch from Canada to the U.S. We're waiting for another colleague from Athens, Greece. So this could be a very interesting panel. I hope you enjoy it. We have Dr. Thomas Teo from York University. We have Dr. Lois Holtzman from Eastside Institute, Dr. Derek Hook, DeQuince University, and Dr. Michael Miller, Upstate Medical University. Dr. Teo will start the process. Gentlemen, and Dr. Holtzman, I would limit you to 15 minutes as we agreed, and Drs. Hook and Miller have 30 minutes as they're doing a joint presentation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A afterwards. And I have here behind me Juan Gallegos. He is an IT specialist. He's going to be my co-driver, my Zoom co-driver today. So he'll be doing the magic controls behind the scenes. So with that said, let's go.
So thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to present via Zoom. Is the audio okay?
Yes.
So I have a little bit of cold. I apologize for that. I hope I don't lose my voice. And as you can see, the title of my paper changed slightly, and there's a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that I think theorizing what neoliberalism means for subjectivity assumes to a certain degree a general or an average person, which really fits back, I think, into certain concepts that humanism has developed. And there's a certain group of people, that is my interest today, or a certain class of people, what I call subhumans, or people who have been subhumanized, that do not fall, so to say, to the same degree under this average person to whom neoliberalism applies. And so I would like to talk about subhumanism, subhumanization, and I use examples. I'm going to start with a few examples from the migration debate. So I think it is fair to say that theories such as Vygotsky made a good point about challenging humanist theories. Her main point is, as the quote says here, the human is a normative convention which does not make it inherently negative, just highly regulatory enhanced instruments to practices of exclusion and discrimination. And so what she means is, of course, what she means is sort of say that normative ideas about humanism have always excluded people who fall outside of this canon. So on the left side, you have the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, and of course, it was the idea of perfect proportions. On the right side, Apollo Belvedere, so to say, the perfect aesthetic ideal, or aesthetic perfectionism reached, so to say, in Apollo Belvedere. And of course, it's very obvious, this idea of human excluded women, excluded minorities, visible minorities, excluded people with disabilities, and so forth, old people as well. And so Vygotsky basically tries to develop, so to say, a post-human theory which talks about life beyond the self, life beyond the species, life beyond death, which takes into account, for example, certain developments in technology. But I don't want to go in this direction. My argument here is basically that although posthumanism is interesting to me, I think we have moved too fast into the direction of posthumanism, and we have to go back to subhumanism, and I try to explain what I mean by this. So at the 58th Venice Biennale, obviously in Venice, this year in 2019, the Swiss artist Christoph Büchel exhibited the Barca Nostra in the Arsenale, which is a former shipyard in Venice. And the Barca Nostra is basically a ship that had capsized in a collision. It had 800 migrants on board, and all of them died in 2015. In the whole year of 2015, about close to 4,000 migrants died in the Mediterranean Sea. This year, about 1,000 migrants have died in the Mediterranean. So this is a part of the phenomenology that I'm interested in. Phenomenology have a slightly different understanding here, in a sense of what we can observe and notice. Carola Rakete and Pia Klemp, two German boat captains, were brought to court for what in the past would have been considered empathetic, heroic reactions or behaviors by saving many of the migrants. But what happened to them is they were brought to court. So Carola Rakete had been arrested for bringing migrants to Lampedusa. Pia Klemp faces 20 years in prison for helping migrants. So what is going on there? Nobody in Europe would accept similar preventable death tolls, I think, in their own countries. In Hungary, this is like, of course, a famous picture. Petra Laszlo at the border with Serbia tripped a migrant, one where a father was carrying a young child while filming them. The United States government, of course, you know that, separates children, puts children into cages, sprays tear gas on running migrant children, tries to use separation as a tool of prevention. Indefinite detention of migrant families and the removal of recreational activities are considered. It has been, of course, identified that children are confronted with a lack of soaps, lack of toothbrushes, and lack of nutrition for children. Some children were forced to sleep on concrete floors as punishment. Scott Warren, who provided food and water to undocumented migrants in Arizona, went on trial for felony count for his actions. The court case ended with a mistrial, but there were 4 jurors in favor of a conviction. So what is happening here? That is my question. And how can we understand it? How can we theorize it? What kind of strategy of power is re-emerging here? And so my hypothesis is that in the context of migration, but also in the context, let's say, of prison populations, people with disabilities, a concept is re-emerging that we have thought had disappeared, and that's the concept of the subhuman. And my argument here is that subhumanism is, to a certain degree, nourishing some of these actions, and subhumanism makes those things understandable. And let me just give you a historical example. I mean, subhumanism is indeed sort of a concept that comes from the 1920s in the United States in the context of eugenics. And Stoddard would be sort of a significant author in this context. He published a book called Underman, and he defined subhumans or undermen as people or persons who measure, and that's a quote, under the standards of capacity and adaptability imposed by the social order. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to have concept not only targets race, but he wanted to have a concept that targets lower classes, the proletariat, as he says, Russian communists. All of them are part of the subhuman class. In Germany, we have looked at the it's an SS educational manual, the Untermensch. It's about 50 pages, and what is so astonishing to me is that this manual contains mostly pictures and visualizations and photographs, drawings that would sort of make the case for what constitutes the subhuman. So in the context of scientific racism, we're used with very scientific theories about other races. So if you look into, I don't know, race mixing in Jamaica, by Davenport. You find tons of tables, tons of statistics. It has all the aura of scientific literature. But if you look at the educational manual, it has very, very few texts, very few scientific arguments. It basically operates only with images and pictures. And which leads me to the idea, basically, that what we have here is a symbolic, affective category. So an idea or a strategy of power that doesn't work anymore so much with cognitive persuasion, but affective symbolic persuasion, and basically just have to look and you see what is the subhuman. So somebody who participates in a caravan, somebody who crosses or climbs over a wall, or in the Canadian context where we have actually refugees coming from the States, people who cross the border into Quebec with suitcases, but not over a regular part. All of this could be understood visually as a form of subhumanism, and therefore, so to say, not eligible for the rights that Americans or Canadians or humans would be afforded to. So, and it's not only that I have this thesis that subhumanism is a re-emerging concept, but also people actually use this concept again. So I found Miriam Riedl, a right-wing FPÖ party functionary in Austria, identified in her Facebook account male refugees as, quote, subhumans. A Canadian Yellow Vest protester who sees immigration as the core issue of politics referred to visible minorities as subhuman. In the infamous ProPublica report on the Border Patrol Facebook group, they pointed out that messages describe migrants as, quote, wild-ass shitbags and subhuman. So it's not only, so to say, so what I'm trying to say is there's a concept, an idea, or a strategy of power re-emerging, but people also actually use this term again, which is quite fascinating to me. And so the question is, what is the relationship to racism? The issue is that, yes, if you have race available and you have racialization available, you of course can racialize people, and you can use, so to say, the traditional rhetoric about racial differences in order to employ certain practical applications. But very often in the context of Syria, and this is of course in the context of Europe, but even in the context of the United States, dealing with the Central American or Latin American refugees, racialization doesn't work as well as subhumanization, because racialization, or let me say differently, if you have a Syrian refugee that might look like Steve Jobs, who has, as is known, a Syrian father, and so it's very difficult to racialize a person who looks like that. You could, you could use religious arguments about the inferiority or superiority of certain religions in order to make a case, but I think it's much easier actually to subhumanize these people, and you subhumanize them. You have a concept of subhumanizing which allows you to subhumanize, and then having them subhumanized basically reinforces the idea of the subhumans. You have a perfect circle. So if I put individuals or persons in very dire circumstances that might show very restricted agency, which reinforces in a person with power the idea that they are actually subhuman. Maria Metzer, another case where tear gas was shot at migrants at the American-Mexican border, here with her two twin daughters, was interviewed, and she said basically she doesn't understand what's happening here. Why would they do that? They are humans like all other people in America. Of course, what she forgot is that if this idea of an effective symbolic idea is correct, of subhumanism, she's not perceived as a subhuman. She's not perceived as a human anymore, but indeed as a subhuman, at least by important government agency, institutions, and persons, of course. And so, for that reason, normal what we regard as normal quotation mark behavior by institutions does of course not apply to her. Of course, subhumanism is an example of the reemergence of fascist thinking. I think it plays a big role in fascist or fascist rethinking. It's not only anymore us or them, as some people have argued when it comes to fascism, or in-group, out-group thinking when it comes to subhumanism. The question for me is, when does sort of the in-group, out-group thinking take on actions and practices that we would not afford to any kind of human being anymore, but only to people that are constructed or constituted as subhuman. But of course, that's a more interesting point for discussion when it comes to subhumanism. And I don't think I have much time left, but I want to only make a further comment. I have here an example of the MS St. Louis, which was of course a traditional refugee ship trying to come to the States and to Canada. People were sent back and had to die in Nazi concentration camps. But what is more important here is that psychologists, or the traditional psychological solution, and I heard it even give presentations about these issues. Oh, we have to raise empathy and we have to make sure people learn to be empathetic. My point is, or what I'm really interested in, is the avoidance of empathy, or the empathy void. I'm not sure how one should label this. Namely, sort of say, when does empathy not apply? Under what circumstances does empathy not apply more? So it's not that people don't have empathy. I'm pretty sure people have empathy when it comes to their own families or children or friends or even their community, but they suddenly lack empathy when it comes to people that are constructed as subhuman. And that is sort of say much more interesting to me. And because it's an effective symbolic category, people try to, of course, operate, and then people operate sort of say on a visual symbolic level, and then it becomes really a struggle about who has the better pictures. This is, of course, a famous picture, Marlon Kurdi, Syrian refugee child who died on the beach, and that raised a lot of empathy. And Latin Canada, for example, having many more Syrian refugees come to Canada. But I'm really cautious if, so to say, if it's only based on effective images and not sort of also on a certain de-ideologization of the concept of subhuman. Because then you have, of course, this is also well known, then you have sort of the counter pictures and people say, okay, this is sort of the other side and you want criminals, and I don't even know if these are criminals or not, I have no idea. But they provide sort of the other images of what people associate, let's say that way, with criminals coming into the country, and then you have a struggle of who has the better symbolic effective images. And I really sort of say a caution against that in critical psychology, that we do not focus solely on images. The rescue ship, it's a rescue ship named after Alan Kurdi. It's a German rescue ship that helps actually migrants and saves actually migrants. So they've used, so to say, the name in order to do that. And coming to American presidents, I mean, Obama noticed that as well, that we have basically the concept of subhuman re-emerging. And if the current president in the United States says that certain people, no human being would want to live in Baltimore, well, the people who live in Baltimore, then are obviously not human, they are subhuman. So another indicator, at least for me, another evidence that this concept of the subhuman is re-emerging, and I think that we need to pay certain attention to that. And if you're interested in post-humanism, I think it's equally important actually to focus again on subhumanism. So I think that would be my presentation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Theo. And now we have Dr. Holzman.
Hi, everyone. I wish I could say it's great to see you, but I can't see you, which is a shame. It's a little weird, but I guess all of us have to get used to that in the coming years. I'm delighted to be here anyway to share some thoughts with you. Um, so I want to begin with a question that I put before us today, which is this: how do we reconstruct our world in such a way that people can not only meet our current needs, but go beyond that to create new needs and wants? I have no answer to the question, for I believe the answer has to be created by what people, including us, do. What I do have is a direction, one that's guided by a methodology that goes beyond the critical to the practical critical. And I take that term from Marx, for whom it meant revolutionary activity, the changing of ourselves that is dialectically united with world changing. This practical critical methodology guides the work that my colleagues and I have been engaged in across the United States for over 40 years, and for the past 10 years in many other countries of the world. In my brief time today, I can only highlight some key features of the approach, which is known as social therapeutics and performance activism. If you're interested in learning more and seeing some on-the-ground examples, there are many books, articles, and videos I can give you reference to. I've chosen 4 features of our methodology that I think are of particular relevance to the future of critical psychology to share with you. 1, engage the epistemological bias. The authoritarianism of Western ways of knowing is often and well critiqued, including by critical psychologists, myself included. All well and good. And while non-Western epistemology should be honored and respected, along with all the other features of a given culture, I think that all epistemologies are authoritarian. It's the epistemic posture itself that is a fetter to revolutionary activity. All peoples are, to greater and lesser degrees, guided unconsciously and consciously by a knowing paradigm, that we can and must know what is, what to do, who we are, how we feel, what is real, what is right, and what is true. Institutions, education, the law, economics, psychology, science, religion, and so on, derive their authority from the knowing paradigm. They socialize us to ways of understanding and feeling and relating that are, especially in the current times, conservative and destructive. Living by the knowing paradigm stifles creativity and discovery, closes off other ways of understanding, and constrains our ability to imagine and create a new world. Which leads us to the second feature. Don't confuse power with authority. As a child of the 60s, I still bristle when I hear the word power used negatively by progressives, as a pejorative, something bad or even evil and a property of those who rule. I guess I'm still a believer in power to the people. I don't know exactly when power lost its revolutionary meaning, but the discourse today is most often about the exercise and abuse of power by those in power. I wonder then what it could mean to empower people. But you may be thinking, aren't these merely different uses of the word power in different contexts? And yes, they are different uses, but not merely. Leaving it at that masks an important distinction that I found invaluable in my political understanding and work. That distinction is between power and authority. Power being created from the bottom and authority being imposed from the top. From this vantage point, being in power and exercising power are as different as can be. Being in power is the commodification of power into authority. Exercising power is engaging collectively, democratically, and creatively in practical, critical, revolutionary activity without commodification. Professionalized and institutionalized psychology, psychotherapy, counseling, social work, healthcare, and education in the United States and increasingly elsewhere practice and promote all manner of dehumanizing authoritarian commodification. DSM and ICD diagnoses, identity politics and identity psychology, testing and evaluation are just the most obvious. The authority of these institutions is so thorough that people not only commodify themselves in these and other ways, we feel we must. At the same time, I believe that people not only need but want to exercise power without commodification. Psychologically, this desire is in nearly constant struggle with the human need to authoritarianly commodify oneself. Given this contemporary human condition, it's a huge creative challenge to create ways to support people to exercise power without commodification, that is, free of authority. Which leads us to the third feature. Reinitiate the development of persons and communities. Mainstream psychology is interested in who we are, and working from that position, it grandiosely and erroneously tells us who we will become. That's because it's thoroughly epistemological and authoritarian, claiming to be a predictive science. Prediction, however, knows nothing of dialectics, of the practical critical, of revolutionary activity. A practical critical, a humanizing psychology is not predictive, but possibility generating, in that it engages directly the human struggle between power and authority, the power of becoming and the authority of being. For human beings are not just who we are as persons, communities, and nation states. We are also, and at the same time, who we are becoming. We all live in a particular culture, society, space, and time. But we also all live in history, by which I don't mean the past, but the totality of past, present, and future. Most people experience themselves societally rather than dialectically living in history and society. They don't feel themselves as simultaneously self and world changers. They don't feel themselves as creators of qualitative transformation, as actors, as active bringers into being new ways of feeling and relating to themselves and others. Reinitiating the development of persons and communities involves building environments in which people can stop being only who they are, societal, and become at the same time who they are becoming, historical. Environments in which they can engage in the revolutionary activity of creating new wants and needs and emotions and relationships. Which leads us to the fourth feature, play and perform. To create new needs and new wants, we have to imagine. More than that, we have to allow our imaginings and our imagination to impact on our past experience, and our past experiences to impact on our imaginings and generate new social activity. There are at least two things people do in every culture, so it seems, that accomplish this. One is play and the other is performing. Both activities allow, indeed they depend on, our being both who we are and not who we are at the very same time. When little children roar like lions in the zoo, they are themselves and not themselves. When babbling babies carry on conversations with adults, they are playing with language and performing as speakers before they know how to talk. They are both who they are, babbling babies, and who they're becoming, speakers. When actors perform in a stage play, they are themselves and the character they're playing at the same time. In both these cases, babies and actors, experiences and imaginings are creating something new and other than what existed before. These four features I've just laid out are the practical critical methodology known as social therapeutics and performance activism. It is studied and practiced all over the US and internationally, from the Mexico-US border and the refugee camps in Europe, from the schools in Brazil and Japan to the streets of Calcutta and the villages of Uganda. From my own work and that of others around the world, we've come to think of what we're doing as a new kind of activism, not a reactive activism, but a reconstruction, deconstruction of the existing circumstances. People coming together with their different histories and identities and beliefs, their agreements and disagreements, and creating something other with them. We've seen firsthand in thousands of cases that to generate new possibilities, people have to perform, to step out of their comfort zones, as the teenagers put it, to do whatever it is they're trying to do without knowing how to do it. They have to play and perform life. And by engaging in this practical, critical activity of deconstruction, they are reigniting their historical identity as revolutionary changers of the circumstances that determine us, creating the possibility that they will not only meet their current needs and wants, but create new, more humanizing, inclusive, relational, and developmental ones. I think you'll agree that all of us need and want that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Holzman. We now have Dr. Hook and Dr. Miller, who will be doing a joint presentation. Dr. Hook, are you leading off?
Sure.
Uh-oh.
I'm not sure you can hear me, and that is really the question of whether Lacanian psychoanalysis and Lacanian theory is a valuable resource for doing critical psychology, or in fact, one of the things that a critical psychology should be most concerned with critiquing. And I've enjoyed my conversations with Michael because I think he's one of the persons who's best able to do that to and fro movement. So I'm going to valiantly or misguidedly try and make a few arguments in favor of why some ideas from the domain of Lacanian psychoanalysis may be valuable to critical psychology. And I'm sure Mike will have some responses to that. And just also to signal right from the outset that I'm pretty ambivalent about some of these issues myself. But here we go. The first argument that I would try to make is that despite the manifest issues, difficulties, problems, conceptual dilemmas that emerge from thinking about Lacanian psychoanalysis, particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis is this big edifice of high theory, which does often take on tones of mastery, is that it has both an epistemic formation and as a form of practice. So you don't have to go very far within Lacanian texts to be able to start building up some of these arguments. The exercise that I gave myself was to try to go through this huge, great, big book of Lacan's, this collection of writings, and do an index search for wherever he mentions psychology. And if you do that, you very quickly come up against a whole series of often quite vitriolic critiques of psychology, not all of which I'll be able to explicate in any detail here. But let's put it this way. We could say that there's at least 5 fundamental Lacanian critiques about what psychology is and what psychology does. Of course, we could ask how many of those critiques are also pertinent when it comes to psychoanalysis itself. But given that we've got limited time, let me just try and highlight some of those. The first Lacanian critique against psychology is that in a way, psychology skews the epistemic field altogether, assuming that there is a psychological subject. Now, both in kind of doctrinal psychoanalysis and in other theories, you could say that this is problematic in and of itself. Do we really have an individual subject in the sense of an individual subject who's cut off from the social symbolic sphere of which they are a part? And moreover, do we have a fundamentally reflexive, unified subject for whom we can imagine that they are somehow consistent? The Freudian idea, the Lacanian idea is that this is problematic, not only on the clinical front, but also in the epistemological sense of maybe that's not the best conceptualization for human subjectivity. So let's keep that one in place. First of all, this somewhat erroneous model of what the subject is. To this, we can add a second one, and this is a strong thesis that runs through various parts of Lacanian psychoanalysis. We could call it Lacan's anti-developmentalist thrust. Lacan is against developmental notions of subjectivity for a variety of reasons. Number one, he thinks that they bring about a linear assumption of time and temporality in how we think about human subjectivity. Number two, for him, they plot a kind of developmental scheme where human subjects exist for a certain period before language and then after language, whereas he thinks it's very much more complicated than that, that to be a symbolic subject is always at some level to be within language and to be dispersed within what he would call a big other or a symbolic realm. You could say that a third critique of the developmentalist paradigm for him comes with this notion of, do we really have these neat sequential stages? He would have some questions about that. A third and maybe even more stinging critique is that Lacan often imagines and conceives psychology as fundamentally predicated on a series of biological presumptions. And I think whatever many of us may feel about Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis, we probably have some agreement with this critique. He feels that how psychology was taken up in the United States, certainly in the 1950s, with a strong emphasis on behavior, not just in the behavioral sense, but in the sense of behavioral change, behavioral and social engineering, he says, means that, and here Lacan sounds very Foucauldian actually, that psychology is often a type of discipline of human change, of human engineering. And for him, that is completely against what the ethics of some kind of psychoanalysis should be. So in as much as psychology is related to any kind of industrial organizational psychology, where there's a strategic sense of how human life should be managed, he thinks it's problematic and he thinks it should be jettisoned. We can add another idea here. It overlaps a little bit with the developmentalist thesis. Lacan wants to suggest that psychology is in some ways wanting to assume nature as a fundamental paradigm. Now, on one hand, you could say, well, what's wrong with that? Human beings are natural entities at some level. Surely we're biological in some sense. But his argument is that humans aren't fully biological in a very particular sense. So not only is he rejecting the reduction of human and psychical processes simply to biological models, which is something I think we presumably agree upon, but he's also suggesting that in as much as we fit human behavior into an adaptationist paradigm, humans adapting to their environments, as having this kind of progressive evolutionary fit within an environment, which may sometimes go wrong, but is fundamentally adaptationist in nature, that we are missing something quite important. And for him, within the clinical domain, that would be the fact that there's something about human subjectivity which fights against any types of adaptation, which often seems to swerve away from that involves some kind of, to use perhaps problematic Freudian term, a lack of fit, a kind of death instinct. So what that means then, whether we're thinking about an anti-developmentalist thrust, an anti-adaptationist or an anti-natural thrust, or an anti-objectionist thrust, Lacan gives us a series of tools, however ultimately problematic they may be, through which we could start to critique psychology and think about what different types of concepts might be necessary if we're going to do that job. Let me just add 30 seconds on what I think is another one. This is one that's kind of difficult to think, actually, because even in our critiques of psychology, I think we often retain much of the basic vocabulary of psychological understandings. And that is for Lacan this idea that psychology seems relentlessly to objectivize things. What does he mean by that? It's often wanting to label things, find objects of knowledge, to find human attributes, whether it's a personality function, whether it's intelligence. It seems in the history of psychology, there's a pronounced attempt to take facets of psychology and give them some kind of object status and study that. He's immensely against that. Even psychoanalysis, he says, has gone too far in these little objectifications of ego, id, so on and so forth. He wants to rather think in terms of a subject of the structure of language, and he wants to think rather in terms of processes rather than objectifications. So that's my little attempt to highlight some strategic ways in which we might, in a conditional manner, operationalize some facets of Lacanian theory, not because we are fundamentally aiming to extend doctrinal Lacanian psychoanalysis, but because we want to see how they might be able to provide an impetus for us to reconceptualize certain notions within psychology.
Do I just jump in here?
Yes, go right ahead.
So, yeah, I think that I don't want to argue directly with any of what Derek has just said. I think that these are all valid points, and but I think that certain things sort of open up within them when we look at Lacanianism as a body of literature and as a culture. And so what I want to do is try to hold open a space for a critique, for critique within a Lacanian approach. So first, I want to start with a Lacan story, a quote from him. He says, "As revolutionary as what you long for is a new master, you'll get one." And he said that to, in a pretty dismissive way, to a group of student protesters out on the street during the uprising of May 1968 in Paris. Or maybe he did, because some people say that actually he didn't say that to a group on the street during the May Days, but afterwards, at the founding of the Department of Psychoanalysis in Vincennes, which was seen to be sort of a holding tank to keep revolutionaries occupied and therefore neutralized. So here, this version of Lacan seems to be saying that the protesters had given something up and was calling into question the function of the institution that had absorbed them. So was Lacan's position that of a cynical patrician, an analyst above all politics, or was it much closer, like Derek suggests, to Foucault's? Was he simply being reactionary, or was he delivering a subversive critique? Embracing that first Lacan, the patrician, we find a culture of Lacanians who, when they see Lacan used in ways they find offensive, intervene from the position of zealous gatekeeper. Jane Gallup, for example, recounts a reviewer response to her manuscript for her book, Reading Lacan, that she should, quote, wait to write about Lacan's theory until she was no longer confused, as though such a time could ever arrive. My own book, I'm going to talk about myself. Lacanians don't usually talk about themselves, but they're talking about themselves anyway, so I'm just going to own it. My own book, Lacanian Psychotherapy, was greeted with a well-publicized review from a Lacanian analyst that it would have been a good book if not for the title. I put the word Lacanian next to the word psychotherapy, thus nullifying any value that the project might have had. That analyst went on to make the case that this act meant that I had not accepted my psychic castration, leaving those in the know to infer that I must be a pervert, in quotes. At the more local but equally weird level, a couple of years ago, I joined a Lacanian group on Facebook that started posting particularly angry memes about Jungians and Kleinians. When I asked the person who posted them whether that kind of analytic nationalism wasn't antithetical to Lacan's injunction to beware the imaginary, I was met with threats of physical violence. And I think these two are different in intensity, but the spirit of these reactions belongs to that Lacan castigating students on the street, denunciations handed down from a position of power. Critique, the political, sometimes the clinical, none are worthy of psychoanalytic engagement. Lacanianism stands apart from critical thinking in this iteration and enforces the boundaries of mastery. But perhaps the opposite problem is more germane. I wonder not how dare we misuse Lacan for merely critical or whatever purposes, but how dare we pollute the project of critique with the miasma of this Lacan? My hope is that there's another Lacan who does not demand identification, one who in fact is deeply committed to moving our thinking away from identifications. In fact, he made a career of accusing his contemporaries of having only identified with an image of Freud while missing the truth of the Freudian discovery. Similarly, some current Lacanians deride others as not Lacanian enough, or as stupid, or as perverse, or psychotic, but they do this out of identification with a man who made his name on the very same move in regard to Freud, which would seem to reduce their precious, inexhaustible, uncritiquable symbolic text that Derek held up a minute ago to little more than a mirror image. They recommit the original Lacanian sin of identification with the master. And what is mastery other than commitment to the evasion of critique? The Lacanian formulation of the master's discourse, even taken from Hegel's Lord Bondsman dialectic, is an illustration that the master, in order to maintain his being, must constantly cover up his own lack, his own contingency and vulnerability, always directing his demand to the other's labor. Mastery is an absolute refusal of accountability and of reflexivity, and must therefore always be a refusal of critique and a call to subjugation. The master must demand, attack, and exploit in order to maintain his position. So what does it mean to identify with the master, to be a good Lacanian? I think if we're going to save what Derek is talking about saving, we need to make a wager that to be a good Lacanian is to be a terrible Lacanian. And I mean that in all the ways that can be taken. It's to refuse critique. It's to seek to subject, to remind the other or others that they have failed confirmation to a Lacanian image while shrouding oneself in a jargon that sounds like the master's master. Sadly, even some of those who have made an effort to step out of the obscurantism of Lacanian writing, present company absolutely excluded, seem to have wedded their clarity to a rigidity that informs their tendentious and academically thin claims against all things non-Lacanian. What's even more unfortunate is that they tend to know almost nothing specific about the object of their criticism, and psychology is a fine example of this, where the behaviorism of the 1950s continues to be taken as representative and where ego psychology continues to be conflated with psychology. But there are others who are not disciplines, but people, other objects of this kind of thing, who all too happen to be situated by oppression, cisgender women and transgender people, to name two of the most obvious. When such people have attempted to change their circumstances socially, they're all too often met with echoes of Lacan's dismissal, that they're searching for a new master and shall soon have one, or worse than dismissal, diagnosis, that these people are all or must be psychotic, or worse, sometimes feminine. This is certainly the case in the Lacanian literature on the question of the transgendered, with the notable exception of Patricia Garavici. The tradition among Lacanians of dismissing all trans people as psychotic was actually instated by Catherine Millot, the same analyst who recently published her memoir, Life with Lacan, in which she blithely recounts her years-long affair with Lacan, her analyst, without ever calling the ethics of that matter into question. Paul Verhaeghe, a famous Lacanian in a paper taking up the recovered traumatic memories movement of the 90s, offers us the following comment about women who were claiming to have been sexually assaulted. Quote, "Besides being a patient, those women who claim to be traumatized are seen as victims, and they deserve not only our counseling, but also our sympathy and even our pity. Nowadays, there are almost no patients left. There are only victims who are in no way whatsoever implied in their situation." And what kind of person loves to be a victim? Verhaeghe tells us in the next line, people in the feminist movement. In a typically Lacanian manner, Verhaeghe makes no specific citation about what feminists he means, but it's plain that he thinks they don't like to take responsibility. And if they took more of it, they wouldn't be blaming their victimizers nearly so much. So maybe in the spirit of what Derek is talking about, a Lacanian rebuttal to Verhaeghe might be that little seems more directly responsibility taking than contributing to a social movement that takes the risks inherent in challenging a power structure that's not in one's favor and speaking truth, as it were, to power. It's the profound responsibility one takes when speaking in ways that counter the big other's desire or demand. And what could be more Lacanian than that? So I made something like that rebuttal to Verhaag recently to a group of Lacanians. And when it came time for questions, an analyst raised her hand and offered a statement and a question. The statement was one of identification. I know Paul Verhaag, and he's a good man. The question, are you looking for a new master?
Mhm.
Thanks.
So one note here, I did receive an email follow-up from Sadar, and he sends his condolences. He's unable to join us this afternoon. So with that said, we'll go into the Q&A. If there are any questions, I believe some volunteers are working the aisles for any questions that you may have. This is for the entire panel. How do we make capitalism less in our lives and take back our true humanistic selves?
That sounds like a good question for Lois.
Lois?
Sure. I have a lot more to say, but what did you think about what I did say?
Comments?
Or the questioner, I'm just asking, how do we, I don't know that we can make capitalism less in our lives without reconstructing, deconstructing it into something else that we don't know what is. However, I do think that we can, that we can, I think that the activity of engaging in that process of in every way I said, of giving up the epistemological bias and of reinitiating the growth and development of emotion, of subjectivity and everything else about human beings and their communities, of playing and performing as a way to get back the childlike, complete, wonderful, cyclical interaction between our experience and our imagining, so that new possibilities come into being. I think that activity in itself is necessary to make capitalism less a factor in our lives. And it might even, in my opinion, if anything's going to transform capitalism into a more humanizing way of living together in relation to both exchange and production, it's going to require people doing that. I don't think running away somewhere and not participating, or I think things like barter system, all the things that people are doing are wonderful things, but that in itself, without further human development in the sense of creating entirely wild new possibilities, is absolutely essential.
I think that we can also, that there are things that we can do sort of within the institutions that we are working in. One of my jobs is I co-direct the Student Counseling Center at SUNY Upstate, and a lot of our outreach has sort of become focused on trying to combat um, narratives around, like one thing that's uh, really popular now is to sort of indoctrinate students into the notion that they should be perfectly comfortable, or that they should kind of like what you were referring to, Lois, in terms of identities, right? Like these sort of identities of being without any sort of wrinkle in your subjectivity. And if you have one, then it's certainly pathological, and it needs to be
Mm-hmm.
you need to buy a solution to it. And so, and that often comes in therapy, right? So, like our outreach to students has been really keenly aimed at combating that kind of narrative.
Yeah, that sounds
That sounds
great.
great.
Yeah. So I think that there are ways that we can, speak to our colleagues and speak to our patients that are just really like practical and just speak to what's going on, and what they're being told, and give them other possibilities.
Yeah. If I can comment on that, I just came back last week from spending 2.5 days at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, where I go twice a year in this kind of official capacity I have. And one of the professors, faculty members, was talking to me about she gave them something from me to read about social therapy and the importance of a particular kind of group therapy where everyone takes the responsibility for their group to grow the group, so that people can develop new emotional responses. And she said they had such a hard time with the idea that they would spill their shit in front of other people. I mean, the idea of group. So I think there is such a strong narrative that locates, any pain, any distress, any emotional and social issues in your life within the individual, that I would love for that narrative to be, critiqued a little bit too in the practice.
So for me, question about overcoming capitalism is not primarily a therapeutic project, but really a political project. And if you look at two major issues that we're confronting today as humanity, there's many issues or many problems, but I would say two significant issues is on the one hand, increasing income and wealth inequality, with all the consequences that this has, and that has been documented extensively. And on the other hand, of course, climate change. And in both cases, with all the consequences that has, in both cases, you could make the case that capitalism is at the root of that. And so, if one wants to overcome those major issues, or you want to address these major issues, you have to overcome to a certain degree capitalism. So this is a theoretical analysis. And now we move from the theoretical analysis, so how do we do that? And of course, lots of people have suggested how we do that. And very often it remains on a voluntaristic or level of suggestion, because the problem is there's a huge entanglement that each of us has with those systems. So it starts, so to say, from retirement, pensions, the wealth that one has oneself, the customs that we have, the habituated practice that we have. It's very, very difficult to break that up in terms of our own entanglements, I think. But so we have a theoretical analysis, what we know, what is at the source of the problems, and then we have sort of the political suggestions, and then you have the human dimension, where people who have habituated are very difficult also make changes and to accept changes. So for me as a Canadian, it's just very difficult to understand that, for example, Americans don't want a single-payer healthcare system. And even hearing arguments against single-payer healthcare system is just so absurdly strange to me. But that is what is a certain reality you have to deal with in the United States. And so you can come down to Hegelian argument that if theory and practice don't fit, then it's too bad actually for practice. Not for theory, but for practice. So we have the theoretical tools. We know what's going on. It's very difficult to changes. And I can also make the suggestion it has to be collective change. Change cannot be on an individual basis either. That's, I think, very often is suggested when they do recommendations regarding climate change. And I grew up in a country where there was significant discussion about environmental protection. So when I went to school, we already said we shouldn't use single-use plastic. We learned in school we shouldn't use single-use plastic. We didn't use plastic bags, just as one example. And so I kept maybe to some of the traditions. When I came to North America, I gave up on those traditions because you realize, of course, yes, it makes you feel personally somehow, morally superior because you yourself commit to all these environmental positive behaviors. But if it's not a collective or a social project, actually, not much is going to change. It has to be a collective project. And in blaming individuals or suggesting solutions on the individual level or suggesting therapeutics on a therapeutic level, for me, are clearly not appropriate for the question how we can overcome actually capitalism.
Can I just add one thing to your list? I agree with you 100%, Thomas. And I think one thing that you left out of what keeps it from happening, keeps people from, let's say, collectively and also dealing with that is the epistemological bias. Like people believe they have to know how to do it. Nobody knows how to do it. And that is one of the major things that stops not just overthrowing capitalism, but many other mundane things in our lives. You don't have to know how to do it to do something. And you can't know how to do it. You absolutely can't. I just want to say, it's not just logically and rationally that we can't know how to do it, because it's never been done successfully, humanistically, or humanizingly. I just made up a new word. But if all we're going on is what we already know, then that is all we know. We have to create new ways, and we have to create new ways without knowing how to do it. So I'm adding that to your list. That is a major part of the social subjectivity of human beings.
Okay. We're gonna move on with a question for Derek and Michael, and then a follow-up question for Derek, and then I have two audience members that will come up and ask you questions as well. So this question is for Derek and Michael. I want to hear about more arguments against Lacanian psychoanalysis for critical psychology.
That wasn't enough?
I think the writer of this note said be short, to the point. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
It's our conference host who wrote that question.
Well, gee.
I can try. I suppose what I would say is, listening to Michael, I find myself kind of convinced by his arguments. So for me, one of the dilemmas of maybe psychoanalysis per se is that historically within critical theory, there's been lots of people who've tried to draw some inspiration or utilize some vaguely psychoanalytic ideas as a way of advancing forms of critique, from Juliet Mitchell to whatever, Theodore Adorno or whatever. And that's a tradition I kind of feel allegiant to. But what I think Michael foregrounds so powerfully is that when psychoanalysis itself starts to try to organize itself as an institution, or as a kind of group identity, like things seem to go wrong very quickly and in very problematic ways. So if that's the case, then maybe the best one can hope for is to think about how certain concepts from that might be utilized. And the example I always use in this respect is if we think about what Frantz Fanon does in Black Skin, White Masks, he does a strategic, conditional type of vernacularizing of little bits of psychoanalysis, which he then theorizes in slightly different ways. So if the question is what we might be able to get from it, I think it's a kind of deconstructive engagement with certain notions that might have a cutting edge outside of there. It's difficult to do that in any elaborate way within a short period of time, but I suppose what I've try to do is to say that there might be some useful concepts from within it to help push psychology and to ask the question of whether psychology is actually a viable discourse of resistance, to be honest, or whether psychology, a progressive form of psychology, is even possible. Now, I'm being a little polemical because, we're in a conference and so on and so forth. And I actually myself don't believe that psychology can't be progressive in some ways. But at least I think it's worth asking the question. And the one quick example about that, I was going to talk a lot more about critical psychology in South Africa as part of a struggle against racism and a part of the work of Frantz Fanon and Steve Biko. And one of as a student, when I was battling to try and read Fanon and understand Fanon, one of the concepts that came to me is that although we often think that there's a kind of psychological type of critique that's happening in Black Skin, White Masks, and there is up to a point, you could say that psychology is never that interesting in and of itself to Fanon or to Steve Biko, the Black consciousness leader in South Africa. It's always something more like a concept of the psychopolitical, if you see what I'm saying. So maybe one lesson to get from some of these texts, I'm not saying we can get this from Lacan, but there's a little bit maybe of it as well, because it's not psychology, it's always within structures of language and the symbolic and so on and so forth. It's this, and that is to say, of the vernacular of concepts and thinking tools that we normally take from psychology, how do they need to be changed? Why do they need to be refashioned? And maybe, for example, instead of thinking about the psychological or the self, we need to think about the psychopolitical, because presumably virtually every facet of what we would consider to be a psychological problematic or attribute or mode of subjectivity is also in this world fundamentally political as well. So I'm not sure that totally answers your question, but that's my best attempt to say something in response to that question.
I think that last split that you're talking about between, what gets categorized as psychological and what political, and the sort of artificiality of, insisting that they can be two different things, that also, and I mean, I guess I touched on this in my talk, but that's also constantly reproduced in Lacanian discourse, right? And I think an interesting conversation can be had, and to some extent is, but it just never seems to go anywhere, as to, and Derek, maybe you can talk more about this, but often a Lacanian analyst will say that, what they're practicing at bottom, what psychoanalysis is, Lacanian psychoanalysis is an ethics, right? That you are performing, you are practicing some sort of ethics. But then often in the same breath, there will be an insistence, because of the way that the Lacanian subject is structured as impersonal, that this ethics has nothing whatsoever to do with any matters that we would normally think about in terms of ethics, right? Like certainly like, the well-being of people, and it also tends to, insist on pinning itself to Kantian ethics, where, the idea of treating the humanity in the other as an end in itself, Kant is careful to not conflate that with a particular individual, but humanity resides in particular individuals, and I feel like, or groups of them, or whatever, and I feel like there's a strange insistence on decoupling ethical awareness of humans from the ethics of psychoanalysis that probably needs to be more deeply looked at.
Mm-hmm.
Have a audience member that has stepped up and would like ask the panel a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to continue with Mike Miller and Derek Hook's Lacanian rabbit hole, I'm wondering if, I think I really agree with Mike about the irony, actually, or maybe even the tragedy of over-identification in terms of the Lacanian deplorables that he was talking about. But I do wonder, because Derek, you're involved in this project in terms, this is Clint, by the way, in terms of the texts on the Écrit, if part of the problem has to do with the Lacan archive as well. Anyone, even those of us on that side of the ledger, know that you can find anything you want to defend your position in Lacan's writings, especially 28 years of the seminars and so on. And so if it's a very sort of the sublime overproduction of the texts, and this is not to say that the Verhage or so on or whatever other deplorables are off the hook, but if it's also something endemic to that overproduction itself that leads to these kinds of egregious statements and practices.
Yeah, so one response to that would be, I feel like doing a puppet show where I could do the Lacan voice and the anti-Lacan voice. I don't know, maybe I'm just performing my my splitness or something. But I suppose the Lacan voice, sorry, okay, Michael, be horrible to me maybe afterwards, or maybe not. But one would then say, well, okay, you can say anything you want from Lacan. What would you prefer? That there was one single authoritative master voice which told us the answer to everything? Presumably not. Okay, I'm playing devil's advocate, so don't get too upset with me. So I think in a way I hear your critique, but the echo of that critique is what would you like? Would you like the authoritarian Lacan, or even more authoritarian than it might have been? Presumably you could argue in some weird way it's far better that it isn't rigidly anchored in some kind of way. Going the other way, I suppose, maybe also adding to what Mike said, in a different way, we could also argue that isn't maybe partly the problem here. Because Michael, I think, does a very good job of saying how in Lacanian institutions and in Lacanian politics and in Lacanian intellectual debates, the trump card is often to do that move back into the psychological reductionism for which psychoanalysis is so infamous for. Like, okay, now, Michael's a pervert because he's even doing that. So this is clearly a major political problem with psychoanalysis, but presumably those guys are going to say, well, or maybe not in terms of that critique, but actually, ultimately, at the end of the day, this is supposed to be about clinical work. It's not supposed to be used outside of clinical work. And in that respect, they're going to be hoisted by their own petard if they're doing exactly that. But what I'm saying is that maybe we have made too many hopes to try and extrapolate it from beyond that domain. I know I'm doing a big self-contradiction here because I've been also trying to say things like that. But I'm just miming in my little puppet show for you what some of the responses may be. And one of those responses, and I think Michael and I both know colleagues who do this kind of move, and they say, well, you guys can debate about it, you could try and apply it in social theory, but it just doesn't work like that. These are concepts devised for the clinic, of the clinic, and that's why we call them ethical, because they're supposed to be there to assist with some form of treatment. And not because we think that they're ethical in some political sense or in some societal sense. No, we don't even try to play that game. And the only reason you guys get into such problems is because you try to extrapolate that discourse beyond the sphere of the clinic into the more social political domain. I'm not making that argument. I'm just doing my puppet show argument or how it could be argued.
Can I comment on that. I'm not a Lacanian. And I don't know if I think I'm addressing the questioner as well, but I loved your puppet show.
Oh, sorry about that.
And I do love it. And you mentioned psychological reductionism as a possible issue here. I just wanted to add that it also seems to me that it's linguistic reductionism in both senses. In the first sense of if you can find a quote that matches this side and this side of, the puppet, this anti-Lacanian, pro-Lacanian, then somehow if that's a problem, then you are guilty of linguistic reductionism, as if words mean something outside of the interpreter. And the second reductionism of it that I see is perhaps, if I understand you, that it's limited to the clinic. Just because, Vygotsky's work was in the first years of the Russian Revolution as a Soviet, trying to develop a systematic Marxist psychology. And people all over the world, including myself and my colleagues, have taken it in all different directions. I don't think he would be happy, and probably, I don't know about Lacan, if the narrowness of his own circumstances made everyone leave it there, So.
Maybe just I could quickly comment if no one minds. I know your work, Lewis, in that respect, and Vygotsky's big hero, but in many respects, for me, one of the reasons he's a big hero is what's the famous rule of genetic development. The idea that what we often assume to be psychological functions are fundamentally social functions in their origin. And we need to always take into account not only notions of mediation, psychological skills, symbolic tools, and so on and so forth. So without ducking and diving too much, I think this is one example where we have a type of psychology which is genuinely, in some respects, revolutionary, precisely because it doesn't want to isolate the individual from the social context in which they're in. So, it's difficult to tie all these ends together, but for me, this is precisely one of the most important resources that we can take from a type of psychology. But then again, I also want to every now and again say about Vygotsky, is this just psychology? Of course, you could say it's activity theory in some respects. It's not just psychology.
No, it's not.
In many respects, that's what I find most instrumental and most useful about that.
Absolutely.
Just regarding your idea about it, the idea that this is limited to the clinic, that this is a clinical endeavor. I think that works until you say, well, then tell me something about the clinic. And then the need to avoid psychologism collapses in potentially collapses in on that position because psychoanalysis, like deconstruction, it's not this or this or this or this. It's certainly not about helping a person adapt, right? And the need to sort of avoid being pinned down on any sort of concrete, and I'm only going to put the word outcomes in giant scare quotes, but the need to avoid talking about that becomes a symptom in itself. Yeah. And it's no coincidence that most of the Lacanian literature has absolutely avoided talking about clinical material or clinical matters.
On here. We have another question from our audience.
It's a question for Thomas. I'm really quite taken and sympathetic to your subhumanist discourse analysis. I'm wondering in what ways it intersects or amplifies notions like Agamben's bare life or Luhmann's notion of disposable bodies. So that's the first part of the question, is in what ways does subhumanism intersect with those particular modes of analysis? The second is, do we need to think about these 20th century discourses in any different way within the context of 21st century virtual capital?
Yeah, that's Uh, I think that's a very interesting question, and let me just make a connection to what was said before. And I make the distinction between the psychological humanities and the psychological sciences, and I have this project where I said we have to revive the psychological humanities, psychologists drawing on history and philosophy and on sociology and political theory and on the arts and on aesthetics and so forth, in order to understand what is going on. So for me, it's always strange to just draw on one tradition or one framework, or not going back to the problems or to the issues themselves and think I can find all the solutions within a certain mastermind such as Marx or Freud or Lacan or Vygotsky and so forth. I understand these important sources for knowledge and for understanding, but if I'm really interested in the object, I might have to draw on a variety of sources. So for me, it's less important whether a mastermind agrees or disagrees with me, but rather sort of say, how can I do justice to a problem? This means, coming back to your suggestion, yes, of course, I can use, the idea of disposable bodies in this analysis, and I haven't done it yet because I grapple with a slightly different problem. But there's no reason, so to say, why to exclude that stream of reflection in an analysis of subhumanism. Equally, you could make the argument, well, lots of post-colonial thinkers have talked about dehumanizing, and to which degree is dehumanizing the same as subhumanizing, and to which degree is it different, and so forth. So I also want to draw, so to say, on dehumanizing post-colonial literature as well. But what I'm trying to say is I haven't drawn on them at the moment, but there's no reason, so to say, in order to get a better understanding of that on a variety of traditions. This is exactly what I mean by the psychological humanities. I have a topic and I want to draw on as many possible sources as I can in order to make sense of this topic. So the question really should be the second question, but I mean, that's why I said sort of I'm not opposed to post-human analysis, and I think what you refer to is, the development of capitalism. How does this intersect, so to say, actually much more with post-human analysis rather than traditional human analysis? That's fair enough. And in Japan, when they're thinking about using robots dealing with Alzheimer's patients and an aging population in Japan, the suggestion that we need more robots dealing with elderly population. So I'm sure that post-human analysis is very apt to deal with these issues. But what I'm interested in is sort of going back, specifically in the context of migration, but I think could also apply to homelessness or the prison population. There we have sort of the re-emerging subhuman practices, subhumanizing people and subhumanizing populations, and that's why I'm interested in that topic. So I'm not saying that this would exclude sort of a more analysis of how capitalism has merged into, I don't know, surveillance capitalism. So I'm not opposed to that analysis, but I'm more interested sort of in a more narrow scope, which is sort of the re-emergence, I think, of subhumanist thinking in the public and in the broad population.
All right, thank you very much. We're at our last question, and panel, if you could be brief in your remarks. What implications does subjectification have in later American contexts of capitalism, different than in the U.S., given the historical resistance to capitalism and colonialism, according to Lacan? Emphasis Latin America.
Can you repeat the question?
What implications does subjectification have in Latin American context of capitalism, different than in the U.S., given the historical resistance to capitalism and colonialization, according to Lacan? Briefly.
Derek?
Mike, I think wants to answer this one.
I'm sorry, did you say subjectification or subjection?
Subjection, I'm sorry.
Wow. I really can't pretend to answer a question about Latin American history and its relationship to capitalism in any sort of informed way. So I just don't think that I'm really qualified to talk about a contrast there. I'm not hearing that.
Come on up. Oh, okay. All right, we have all right. The person asking the question will speak in Spanish and then will be translated for you.
Thank you. Hi. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo vamos a entender la subjetivación en el contexto latinoamericano según Lacan, considerando que el contexto latinoamericano lleva siglos de lucha contra el capitalismo y la decolonización?
So basically, Latin America has been resisting capitalism and colonization for centuries. So in this case, according to Lacan, how would we address that historical context with the context of subjectification?
I can offer some comments. I mean, I was also going to speak a little bit today about critical psychology in the South African context. Can't say anything about Latin America. It's just not my area of expertise. But one guiding question that I thought would be interesting, and it's a shame I'm not at the conference in person to ask it, but it seems to me that it'd be a fascinating exercise, historical, political exercise, to do a geopolitical history of psychology as certain forms of psychology come to predominance in certain parts of the world at certain times. Because presumably they either fit with or advance certain ideological agendas in those parts of the world at that time. So what I hear in the question in terms of the relationship to subjectification is maybe there's some interesting comparative comments to be made about how subjectivity is understood in relationship to psychoanalysis in one part of the world as opposed to another. And I think those questions are fundamentally interesting, but I think we need a whole lot more historical fine-grained work to be able to start to offer anything like a possible hypothesis. I don't think we're able to do that as a panel. But maybe also just to add a critical remark back to your question. If I'm understanding the question correctly, if you are saying something like, what would Lacan say about this? Presumably that's not the right level to ask the question, because presumably if we're asking a properly historical question about psychoanalysis and forms of subjectivity within Latin America, presumably we need to also ask the questions of what are the historical conditions of possibility that make Lacan seemingly an important option here, when maybe he isn't. Well, maybe he is, but you want to do the Foucauldian move of going behind the given set of theoretical, given psychologistic apparatus, conceptual apparatus, and say, what are the conditions of possibility that have made that apparatus work here and now? And so I don't think it's possible to answer that question within certainly my expertise, perhaps not within the panels, but it is, one response to it would be, how would we be able to answer that question, and what would be the kind of historical and political research that would enable us to do that? And I don't know if we know the answer, but the best thing I think we could do here is ask another question, and that is, how would we do that?
One thing that does come to mind just briefly is, thinking about colonialism and the history of many colonizers in Latin America, and just wondering if there's maybe some use in thinking about how maybe especially, and again, I'm not an expert, I'm out of my depth, but like maybe especially in that context, the notion of like object A might be informative in terms of the struggle around subjectification, the struggle around identity and speech, that when you have so many sort of powerful masters demanding to put people in a position where they produce some sort of surplus enjoyment for this, you know, for the master. And that's happening so explicitly and so contestedly at a collective social level in a way that maybe in the United States, in some ways, it tends to be a bit more insidious. That maybe there's a way to kind of think object A politically and socially that's specific to a Latin American context.
All right, thank you. With that, this wraps up the virtual panel. I want to thank the panelists so much for taking this time this afternoon. I know you're living in different parts of the country and time zones, but we really appreciate your contributions here to the conference in New Mexico. Round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, and safe travels to everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.